The sight of saffron-robed Buddhist monks taking on oppressive regimes is becoming a familiar pattern in Asia. Last year it was Burma. This week it is Tibet. Today, anti-Chinese demonstrations in the Tibetan capital Lhasa turned deadly. China was quick to blame the disturbance on Tibet's spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, and claimed it was all an attempt to sabotage the Beijing Olympics. News coming out of Tibet is very restricted, and the BBC's James Reynolds reports now from the Chinese capital, Beijing.
High up on the roof of the world, something dramatic is going on, and China is trying to black it out. But a patchwork of snapshots is now getting through. Some have been sent to the BBC by tourists and campaigners. They show demonstrations in Tibet's capital Lhasa, the most violent for nearly 20 years.
Immediately, police materialized from various sectors of the temple, crackling into radios. The monks were set upon. Several of us saw the monks being beaten to the ground, monks who were at the edge of this maroon stream of humanity, beaten in the ground. Some of them were kicked in the stomach.
And more than 100 marchers, mostly Tibetan exiles, have been remanded.
This is what's been happening all day here in Beijing. Every time the BBC starts mentioning something about Tibet, Chinese censors black out the channel. And this is what you can see on Chinese state TV, an ordinary discussion about politics, no mention whatsoever of Tibet. From exile in northern India, Tibet's spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, is watching. China accuses him and his supporters of premeditated sabotage. But he's called the protests a sign of the deep-rooted resentment of the Tibetan people.
Even now, after 4 days, we do not know how many were shot, how many are injured, how many are arrested. We don't have the real figure, and this is, I think, a big concern.
And in London, protesters have gathered outside the Chinese embassy. Gordon Brown said that he's very concerned about what's happening in Tibet. But at the moment, there's no talk of Britain boycotting China's Olympics this summer in Beijing. China had seen this year as the perfect chance to show off some fresh images of a new, more confident China. But instead, the world has a darker set of pictures to study. It's not the kind of photo album that China had in mind for 2008. James Reynolds, BBC News, Beijing.
Well, for more on those growing protests in Tibet against Chinese rule, I spoke a brief time ago with Robert Barnett. He's a Tibet specialist at Columbia University in New York City. Professor Barnett, the Chinese official who now administers Tibet has been described as the Rottweiler of the Chinese administration. What is life like at the moment for Tibetans?
Well, it's basically been a state where Tibetans can't talk about anything political or anything critical of the government. Even if they're unhappy about economic policies, it's difficult for them to mention anything that would be in opposition with the party leadership there. And the party leadership, a new figure, this man Jiang Qingli, brought in 2.5 years ago, brought in very strong rules banning students and all government employees from any form of religious practice. So this is very unusual. That doesn't really exist anywhere in inland China. So the situation there has been very tough.
If it is a state almost in silence, as you seem to describe it, how surprised were you by both the scale of these demonstrations and how well organised they seem to have been?
Well, I think you put your finger on this. This was really astonishing, I think, for everybody. Everyone who has lived and worked in Tibet knows there's a very deep level of discontent and unhappiness about the pressures of life there. But nobody for almost 10 years has dared to take to the streets and say so, and not in this degree. And as you say, not with the amount of planning that we saw the monks taking to their demonstrations in the first 3 days of this week. Quite carefully thought out, not violent, quite focused, including new tactics like sit-down strikes. So this is a wholly new phenomenon. And it was quite impressive. And actually the Chinese were quite impressive. They responded in a relatively measured way. They didn't shoot these people dead in those demonstrations with the monks. But today, unfortunately, the lay people demonstrating, that's been spontaneous, much more aggressive and violent. And then the Chinese have responded in a much more traditional way.
Professor Barnett, would you say that the Tibetans are now fighting for more than just freedom of speech and practice of religion? Because of the large number of Chinese living there, it is now more a fight for their own culture?
Actually, I would go even one stage further. You put it well, but I think the issue is who decides. Who decides what our religious policy should be, and who decides even what our economic policy should be, and how many migrants we should have each year, and whether we should have Tibetan in middle school or just primary school. I think fundamentally Tibetans are saying it's their country, or whatever you call it, their region. They should be allowed to make these decisions through their leaders and their own rulers. And of course this is not something China wants to hear. It isn't the same as asking for independence, but China claims that it already has given these people autonomy. Unfortunately, it hasn't really happened. The place is run by Chinese leaders in the party, and the government leaders, who are Tibetans, seem to have no real power.
Professor Robbie Barnett, thank you so much for joining us there from New York.
Thank you.